Oh, yeah.
All right. What we're talking about today is we're going to continue with extreme values. What comes to your mind when I say the word extreme?
Hardcore.
Extreme values. Extreme numbers. Like the highest and the lowest, right? So sometimes we have a highest and a lowest value in a particular area, right? That's when we call it a relative or maximum or relative what? Minimum, because it's the maximum relative to that particular area, right? Now we also have maximums and minimums that are called absolute maximums in there. And those are the extreme values that are the complete extreme value for that whole graph, not for that just that little area. So they're either the highest of the highest or the lowest of the lowest. Got it? Pretty simple? Okay, so we're going to kind of explore today, and some of you might get bored, but just bear with me. Some people actually need the exploration to internalize the understanding behind this. Alright, so let's write the definitions about the two, the relative and the absolute. See if we can define the difference. How do I know I have relative extrema? What are those? I'll get you started. Relative extrema are points. I get it. Getting somewhere.
I thought you were just gonna write R. No, I thought that was it.
Relative extremas or extrema?
Huh?
Relative extrema.
Extrema. What's another word for relative?
What? Local.
Local. They could use the word local on the AP test. Don't freak out. Relative extrema are points on the graph where the graph does what? How do I know that I have a relative extrema? Beautiful. So that's where the graph changes from increasing to decreasing or decreasing to increasing, right? The first derivative changes from positive to negative or negative to positive. So there are points on the graph where the graph changes from increasing to decreasing or vice versa. That's how you're going to be able to separate relative max and min from absolute max and min. Because at an absolute maximum and min, it does not necessarily have to change from increasing to decreasing. It just has to be the highest point on the graph. Okay? How about the absolute minimum? That has to be the what? The lowest point on the graph. Understand the difference? Absolute. Extreme. What would be the other name for that one?
Global.
Now you're talking about the whole graph, the entire viewing width, the entire domain. Yes? So absolute extrema are what? The highest and lowest points on the graph. Whichever one's the highest one on that graph, that's the absolute max. Whichever one's the lowest one is the absolute max. Easy? Kindergarten stuff? You ready for the assignment?
What?
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do it.
And alright, so
I want to see how far we go.
let's look at this guy right here and let's answer the questions below. Right? So it says identify the coordinates of the relative extrema of f. So can you tell me the coordinates? What does it mean when it says the word coordinates?
An X and Y.
Very good. So they want the point x, y. So tell me where I have relative extrema specific. Make sure you classify. Where do I have a relative min?
Negative 3, 0.
Right here, negative 3, 0. Okay, where else?
2, negative 6.
2, negative 6. Okay, where do I have relative max?
1, 3.
1, 3?
Negative 1. Or -1.
Negative 1, 3. Are we okay? Everybody's able to find those? What does the next one say? What are the coordinates again of the absolute extrema? So now I'm looking at this graph and I want to know what is the highest point on it and what is the lowest point. So what would be the absolute max? Is there an absolute max?
Well,
It goes on for forever, so is there one?
no.
No. Because it's gonna, once you think like, oh, this is it, just kidding, and there's more, right? Cool? How about the absolute min? Is there an absolute minimum? Where would that occur? 2, -6. This is the lowest of the lowest point on the graph. Nothing lower than that. Super easy? Kindergarten stuff? What was the slope of the tangent line at these values right here? 0? What do we call those numbers? Critical what?
Numbers.
Critical numbers? Okay. Remember that. So critical numbers occur when the first derivative is equal to 0, right? Or undefined, right? So these were relative maxes and mins because the function was changing from decreasing to increasing, back to decreasing, back to what? Increasing, right? Okay, and the first derivative was equal to 0 there, right? What about over here? Would this be a relative min? Yeah, the graph changes from decreasing to what? Increasing, but what is the first derivative then? Undefined, is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a critical number, right? It's a potential max or relative max or relative min. Do you understand? Just throwing that stuff out there. Okay, so where do I have relative mins on this guy?
-3.
-3, -4. Good. And? 3, 2. Okay, where do I have a relative max?
-1,
-1 and 4. Excellent. Okay, now let's look at the absolute extreme. Where would I have an absolute max? 6, 5? 6, 5. Is that the highest point out of all of them? Is there anything above it? Okay. What would be my absolute min? -3, -4. This one right here? Okay, cool. What's the difference between these two graphs?
One's closed and one's open.
One's on a closed interval, right? And one is not? One, the domain is all real numbers, and this one, what's the domain of this one?
-5 to 6.
From -5 to 6, right? Okay. Anything that you notice there? What was this point? This point was two things.
It's relative min and absolute.
It was a relative min and
Absolute.
an absolute min. Does that have to happen all the time?
No.
No? Like if something's a relative min, does it have to be an absolute min?
No.
No. What if something's an absolute min? Does it have to be a relative min?
Yes.
Yes or no? No?
because, like,
Some of you are saying yes.
No,
If you're saying no, why?
because
Oh, wait, no, it doesn't.
Because it has to change from what? Decreasing to increasing. This is an absolute max, but it's not a what? Relative max, right? So could it be that they're the same thing? Yes, but do they have to be? No, okay? So that's something that I want you to understand. That a relative min could be an absolute min, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be. So the big thing to understand is relative maxes or mins occur when the function changes from increasing to decreasing, decreasing to increasing. Okay? Absolute extrema, nothing has to change. They just have to be the highest point or the lowest point. You got it? That's what this whole exploration was about. Did you understand that? The difference between relative and absolute. Awesome. Okay, so on the domain of the given function, we already answered this, but let's write it, make it formal. Did the absolute extrema occur at the function's relative extrema? Did I ever get absolute maxes or mins at the same place where I had relative max or mins?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. But what's something to remember?
Not all.
It doesn't have to be, right? Okay, so let's write that down. So the absolute extrema could occur at a relative min or max. However, this does not have to occur. Does that make sense? It could, but it doesn't mean it has to. Maybe? Okay? Alright. Can we move on? Yes? No? Yes? Maybe so? So we're looking at the same graphs again. I didn't mess up. Except now, what is it that I'm doing when I ask my questions? Well, now I'm only asking in particular intervals, right? So you're only looking at that part of the graph. So on the first one, it says identify the absolute extrema. So what do I want there? Do I only want the x? Do I only want the y? Or do I want the whole point? Gotta understand how to read, because that's the way it's going to be on the AP. Absolute extrema, they want the whole point. They want the coordinate, okay? So let's see. Now I'm looking at it only from -2 to what?
3.
-2 to +3. That closed interval. Okay? So imagine that the rest of it isn't there, and I'm looking for the highest and the lowest point on that area. So what would it be? At -2, what is the value? Because that might be important.
2.
Like, más o menos 2, right?
Yeah.
At 3, what is it?
0.
0. So if I'm only looking at that part of the graph, what would be the highest point? -1, 3. And what would be the lowest point?
2, -6.
2, -6. So that's my absolute max and my absolute min. Easy? Absolute max we said was -1, 3. Absolute min 2, -6. What else are those 2 points? They're also relative maxes and relative mins, right? Okay. Let's look at the next interval between -4 and what? 1. So now I'm only looking at the graph from here to here. What would be the point at -4? So I know where it stops at 4. What would be the point at 1 so I know where it stops? -3. So I'm only looking at the graph from there to there.